This video is sponsored by viewers like you at patreon.com/casualhistorian. Click the top link in the description to learn more. Why are we so obsessed with science? On YouTube and other popular media, we are bombarded with this glorification. Now, don't get me wrong, science is important. The fact that I am able to make and you're able to watch this video is because of science. But do we really need it shoved in our faces like this? We've turned people like Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson into household names. This fetishization is even more prevalent on the internet, which worships those two as gods, even when they're talking about stuff they know nothing about. And on educational YouTube, science is king. Why is this? Where did this current obsession come from? Well, I think I have the answer. It goes back to the end of the Cold War. With the Soviet Union gone, the United States no longer had a geopolitical rival. We were on top of the world, but what's the one thing everyone on top is worried about most? Losing that #1 spot. You younger viewers probably aren't old enough to remember this, but in the mid-90s and 2000s, a moral panic swept through the United States. This fear was that the United States was falling behind the rest of the world in math and science. Movies like Idiocracy was a response to this fear, portraying a world where America became really stupid and anti-intellectual. Wisecrack has a great video on it, and you should watch it after you finish this video. Anyways, there was a demand that the government do something about this decline before America lost its place in the world. In the US, the educational system is controlled at the state and local level. So the federal government can't make laws creating national standards. This left the demands at the state level, and numerous states, especially my home state of California, responded with a gusto. Prior to the 1990s, students in California public schools took the California Assessment Program Test, or CAP. In 1990, it was replaced with the California Learning Assessment System, or CLAS, and in 1998, that was replaced with the Standardized Test and Reporting Program, or STAR test. I was attending a private school at the time, and even they were doing this test. The California state government spent so much money on revamping the educational system that the state had a budget crisis in 2002, which resulted in Governor Gray Davis being recalled in 2003 and subsequently replaced by Arnold Schwarzenegger. The federal government would eventually respond to the moral panic in 2001 with the No Child Left Behind Act, which tied federal funding for public schools to the adoption of national education standards. The Common Core standards is a more recent response to this same moral panic. My thesis is that this moral panic from the 1990s is what led to the science fetishism we see now. With this thesis comes another question though. Was the panic justified? When we hear the term moral panic, we usually assume that it is unjustified, but that's not the case. In the 17th century, there was a moral panic over witches, which has shown to have not been justified. In the 1950s, there was a moral panic over communists infiltrating the US government, which actually did happen, but that's a story for another time. There was a moral panic in the 60s and 70s over the sexual revolution, and although the data from this time period is still coming in and being analyzed, the answer to it doesn't seem to be a simple yes or no. And in the 1980s and early 90s, there was a scare over Satanism, which turned out to be more annoying than harmful. So what about the science and math panic of the 90s and 2000s? Was that justified? Well, similar to the sexual revolution, the data is still being collected, but it's looking like it wasn't really justified at all. Comparing educational systems across the world is difficult because they don't use the same standards. In the US, scoring below 70% in a class or on a test is considered failing, but in Japan, failing is getting less than 50%. In this context, American schools actually have a higher standard in education. There's also the fear that Chinese schools were outperforming American schools, but this is only the case when you look at schools in big cities. But outside those areas, they are quite behind American schools. So not only were American schools not falling behind most foreign ones, but the United States also attracts the best educated people from around the world due to its economic prominence. Okay, so maybe this moral panic was unjustified, but what's the worst that happened? A state governor got recalled, and now we have to listen to Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson lecture on us on areas of public policy they have no knowledge of. Well, there have been other knock-on effects. We constantly hear about science not getting enough funding, but they get far more funding than any other areas of education. More than history, the humanities, and the social sciences combined. The hiring rate for colleges is also pretty bad. Universities are always looking for more science and math professors, but they only hire one non-science teacher for every 2 that retire. And a lack of funding and focus on history in particular has had an impact on the writing ability of students entering college. One of the biggest complaints of freshmen undergrads is that their writing ability is usually behind their grade level. Prior to the moral panic, history classes were one of the places where students learned to write. But the shift away from writing assessments towards science and math, which are better measured via multiple choice tests, reduced the number of written assignments and tests they usually administered. In fact, all too often, history wasn't even something state or nationwide assessment programs looked at. The cynical historian has some great stories of grading undergrad tests and seeing some of the ridiculous answers in short answer questions. For those of you who may not know, a common type of question you see on a college level history test are asking students to identify a term and its significance. Explaining the significance of a thing is the primary job of historians. Otherwise, we would just be chroniclers. History teaches students to identify why something is important, whereas in science, it's just a bunch of data you plug in or gather. There's also negative repercussions for science itself. I don't know about you, but I really hate the "I fucking love science" people. This community of science cheerleaders have not improved the average person's knowledge of science, but rather simply commodified the appearance of loving science. Now, as a dirty capitalist, I don't have a problem with commodifying knowledge, but on an academic and scholarly ground, I can't condone this low-level nonsense. You have people who claim to love science when in reality they just like having a treasury of fun facts or watching lights and explosions. This phenomena is perfectly illustrated by this comic from Cyanide and Happiness.
Did you know that human hair and nails are made from the same kind of stuff? Yeah, I love science. I'm not really sure you understand love or science. When you love something, you don't just love the exciting and fun parts. You love the boring parts just as much. People who truly love science spend their lives studying the tedious little bits as well as the big flashy facts. You don't love science. You're looking at its butt when it walks by.
This type of science appreciation just leaves you with a bunch of people who will blindly follow what science communicators say, even when it has nothing to do with what they are supposed to be knowledgeable of. Now, before I end this video, I just want to say that I don't begrudge the success of big science channels on YouTube, and I have nothing personal against them. I also don't blame them for this problem. They are a product of the problem rather than a problem itself. However, they are part of a feedback loop. I'm not telling you to not like science, I'm just asking that you be a little more critical of the cult built up around it. If you enjoyed this video and would like to learn more about history to balance out all that science propaganda, I suggest you watch my Historian Essentials playlist. Or you can watch this other video that YouTube thinks you will like. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.